All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are joining us from today. Welcome to day 3 of the Executive Summit discussing the future of cloud native security. Thank you so much for those who are back with us for a second or even a third day of this 3-day event here. This is the final day, so we've got some great sessions lined up for you today. And for those that are just joining us for the first time, welcome. Hope that you will have an opportunity after the event to go back and catch up on any of the content that you might have missed. But like I said, we've got a great set of sessions lined up for you today. Kicking off today's day 3 with IAM, Identity and Access Management. The title of our first session this morning is I'm Never Going to Give You Up, Never Going to Breach Your Cloud. A little reference there for some of you who get it. It looks like the chat room is already lighting up with people who know the song. So hopefully that will be stuck in your head for the rest of the day. And you'll really enjoy it. And every time you go into a cloud identity situation, it'll come back to you and hopefully discourage you from doing anything that you shouldn't do that might lead your cloud to be breached. But we've got a fantastic panel today. We're joined by a couple of real expert practitioners who have been doing identity and access management in cloud environments for a number of years. We're going to get into intros in just a minute, but first, just a quick welcome to Tyler and Alexi. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Give a quick wave to the audience, and let's start to let's get to know our speakers and our panel. So first, Alexi Lipitsky, Technical Product Manager from Spotify. Welcome, Alexi. I know it's not morning where you're joining us from today, and it looks a little bit dark in the background there, but thank you so much for making the time and joining us a little bit late in your afternoon. Why don't you tell the audience just a few words about yourself and some of your experience in the cloud, and just anything you'd like to share about why you are here having this conversation with us here this morning.
No worries. Hi from Stockholm. It's my pleasure to be here. My background is actually started in infrastructure engineering. So I was working with platform infrastructure pretty much my whole life and so on. And I started working at Spotify as a site reliability engineer. And I went through a number of challenges, number of teams. I coordinated the migration to Google Cloud Platform as well. And in 2017, I started focusing more on security. It was about the time when Spotify was preparing to go public. And one of the challenges which we were solving back then was identity and access management. And of course, since then, our security department has grown a lot of changed. But I think one thing which stayed constant is identity and access management. This is something which we have been working on for many years and continuing working on.
Yeah. And
that's the reason I'm here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it sounds like it's a continuous process that we're going to talk about, I'm sure, a little bit later in our discussion today. That's great, Alexi. And let's welcome our second expert to the panel today, Tyler Smith, Senior Cloud Security Engineer with Allstate. Tyler, thanks you so much for being here with us today. And why don't you do the same, if you don't mind, just share a few words about yourself and how you came to be in this conversation with us here today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've got a background in application development. I've started installing software at hospitals and decided I'd rather write my own software, write my own bugs rather than deal with what other people wrote for me. So I moved into application development, Java, .NET stacks a little bit. My start in the cloud was about 4 years ago, and I got reorganized from a Java focused team, and I was told, okay, you're now an infrastructure person. Go figure out the cloud. Okay. So that was a bit of a jump, but quickly fell in love with working on the cloud and being able to solve all sorts of problems in different ways and a lot faster than I had seen on-premise organizations do it. About 2 years ago, I started at Allstate and came into a more specific cloud security focus than before, working on general compute and storage. And after realizing that everybody hates IAM and very few people actually want to do it what I would term the right way to do it and keep things secure. So I kind of saw it as an opportunity to, specialize and really help everybody else who hates it not hate it so much, or at least not have to deal with all the icky parts.
Yeah.
Try to make it better for everybody.
Yeah, that whole two things in there that we're definitely going to kind of unwind a little bit more. One is, why does everybody hate IAM, as you say? And two, why does nobody want to do it? Let's call it right. We're gonna dive into both of those. But let's set the stage, and that's great background. And so, audience, I hope you understand. This is a great opportunity to get some questions answered. We will be trying to take as many questions as we can from the audience. There's a Q&A section of the chat. Please do drop things in there. I'll be monitoring that as we go through today's discussion. So if you do have questions, please do surface them there. And we'll try to make sure that we can get Alexi and Tyler to weigh in on those topics. So let's talk about the IAM problem. Why is cloud identity so difficult? And it's interesting for me and my own background. I've been doing nothing but cloud for about the last 10 years. I joined AWS in 2010. Left a little while later, but have stayed in the ecosystem ever since. I was actually at Amazon when IAM launched. And at the time when it launched, it was one of those things that we all said, oh, thank goodness, this is so great. Because before IAM, and this is like the early days of the cloud, so many of you may not remember this, all you had was your root credentials. So if someone had access to your account, they had access to your account, everything in it. They could do anything that you could do. So even if I created my own AWS account for my organization as Jeremy, if I wanted to share access, I had to share all of it. And then we got IAM partway through my time at Amazon. And then we started to explain to customers, well, great, this means that, Jeremy and Tyler and Alexi don't have to share credentials anymore. So they don't have to share passwords. Oh, and by the way, they can have different permissions. What we didn't realize at the time was that 10 years later, we'd be talking about, boy, we've created something that has, yes, a lot of power, but a lot of complexity. And then to Tyler's point, people really hate in some visceral ways sometimes because it is so complex. So why is cloud identity so hard in your opinion? Maybe let's go to you, Tyler, first. Like when you hear or when you say that phrase, like people hate IAM, what is it specifically that you think they hate the most?
With AWS in particular, it's complex. It's multi-layered. It's the true definition of, onion and peeling back all the different layers to try to get what you want, which is the middle, or just getting access to something. If you look at IAM on-premise, it's a whole lot simpler. Many organizations, it's LDAP based. So you have, most things tie back into that. Your database credentials, your system account, they're at the end of the day, usually, of course, I'm generalizing here, but it's usually like an Active Directory account or LDAP. It's a lot simpler. You've got a couple of known things and known ways to deal with it. But when you go to the cloud, you're dealing with inheritance and different types of things that don't really correlate back to the on-premise world. Mm-hmm. So when people go to deal with access in the cloud, it's new concepts, new constructs, different ways to interact. And especially as you get into AWS with assume role, the complexity just blows up. So everybody, they kind of freak out when you try to go to the least privileged model. Usually people are walking from one error to the next, and just continual. And so they get frustrated and they say, fine, just give me all access to everything of this service, right? Just make it star. I just want to figure out how to make it work. And then they say, and then I'll figure out how to scale the permissions back. That rarely actually happens. Yeah. So then you end up with over permissioned identities. Yeah.
That reminds me, I mean, that whole process of I'm trying to troubleshoot this. It's not working the way I expect it to work. I'll just open up access. And then later I'll go figure out what the specific thing that I need was, and I'll take away everything else. I mean, we see that approach from DevOps teams like across the board, not just with identity, but even with like, oh, I can't get into a server I need on SSH or RDP. I'll just open that port up. Oh, not to my IP, that's not working. I'll just open it to the world, or S3 buckets or what have you. So yeah, I can totally get where you're coming from. Alexi, does that kind of match some of the challenges, particularly around the complexity and that let's say that debugging process? Does that match some of the challenges that you've seen over the last few years working on identity?
Definitely. And to be more explicit, I think there are two types of teams which get sick of IAM. Of course, we have feature teams, people who really care about developing services and shipping a product and so on. And that's true about security in general, is that feature developers are not really excited about security. So maybe now, of course, there are some exceptions, but overall, it's more like a friction people have to go through. And of course, they don't have background, or they are not interested in learning as well. So in that case, my intention is always like keeping it as simple as possible. It's best if they don't have to deal with it, if they don't know how it works. It's just like all abstracted away and so on. And when they have to deal with it, of course, like grant everything to everybody, and let's move as fast as possible. And honestly, I cannot really blame them for that. Now we really are equipped with very good tools to make those workflows very fast and frictionless and so on.
Interesting. And I'll definitely want to hear more about what you can share around those tools, or at least the process around them, when we get to some of the solution side of it. But before we get there, I kind of want to understand one thing that you mentioned there is around, this friction that we often see between teams that are explicitly told your job is to deliver fast and move fast, right? And that's kind of the whole value prop of the cloud is I can be as agile as I need to be, I can move as quick as I need to be. And then teams like yourselves who are told, hey, make sure that we don't have incidents and we don't have data breaches or data exposures. And there's like this tension between like, move fast, do whatever you need to do, but don't do the wrong stuff, right? And I think that's where a lot of the problems can really arise. Let's talk for a second, if we could, about something that Tyler mentioned there with assume roles. And just so everybody in the audience is kind of aware of this, assume roles, if you will, are effectively the evolution of service accounts. If you think back to kind of, pre-cloud days, you would have, let's say, one server that needed to talk to another server with a particular piece of software or a particular process. And the way that that was typically done was by putting a set of credentials into server A so that it could go access server B. And you would see that various places. That could be inside something like a control panel, that could be inside a credential file. That could be inside secrets management if you were pretty sophisticated. But that was very often, a set of credentials stored inside the operating system of a physical host. And the weakness of that system is that if somebody gains access to the host, they gain access to those credentials as a consequence of that. And so assume role is effectively the cloud-based evolution of that, where that set of credentials is no longer stored inside the operating system, but it's stored in something called a metadata layer where it's associated to the piece of infrastructure. And that can apply, Tyler, keep me honest here, but that can apply to a number of different services specifically within the cloud provider. So it's everything from compute instances to database instances to storage assets and so on. Is this something that your organization is using actively today? Is that something where you guys have kind of pivoted towards assume role as a best practice? And if so, why?
Well, it's rather, in many AWS services, it's rather ingrained. You kind of don't get the choice unless you want to do things the hard way. EC2 instances, Lambda functions, RDS instances, there are others like EKS, ECS, where it makes it easy to do the authentication. And if you don't leverage those, then you have to go take care of the integrations yourselves. And that usually means that you go back to that era of hard-coded credentials, or they're encrypted in some other place, but you still have to have access to get to them. So leveraging the native identity-based authentication that comes a part of AWS IAM, it really removes a lot of the friction, a lot of those things. You don't have to have that. I call it credential zero. I'm sure there's other better phrases for it, but let's think about if you had a server with some sort of password store. How do you authenticate your server or your application to that password store? You have to give it an identity, a password, a token, something that lets it connect. With AWS, you can use the identity of that server, that metadata, to handle that authentication over to where you need to go. Classic examples, going from EC2 to an S3 bucket to get or push data to it. You let the identity of the server handle that easily, whereas you would have to go do some crazy workaround to get past that. So yeah, it's something we heavily leverage and we have to be very careful of, because the identity, you get sprawl. You have to be very careful of that and who can use those identities.
Yeah, and that really brings in, I think, one of the one of the secondary challenges to it is, so yes, you get the upside of getting rid of like, static credential storage or potentially credential storage in the raw on these different, resources, but then the identity associated to the resource has a set of permissions. And there we come to the same question, like, does it have the permissions that it needs, or does it potentially have too many permissions? Last year there was a well-publicized data breach from Capital One that I'm sure both of you probably spent some time analyzing, being practitioners in the space like myself. Identity was one of the key components that was, let's say, partially to blame, and specifically to blame for the exposure of the data out of the S3 bucket. It was not the beginning of the breach, right? The beginning of the breach came through an application layer that then allowed access to a host layer, but then the host layer allowed access to the identity. Alexei, did you spend any time kind of looking at that? And did you have any thoughts about, what might have been wrong with the setup that Capital One had, or ideas about how that could have been done better?
Yeah, of course. So we talked a lot about identity and identity, an assume role and workload identity in GCP. And this part, it just identifies the service which is given access to something. But the permissions themselves, it's this like authorization layer, and there needs to be some governance model on this authorization layer. Who is given permissions, how those permissions are reviewed, and so on. And the problem is, of course, most of those processes, especially in the compliance space, they rely on this manual review. Like once in a while, somebody has to go and audit those records and see if they're saying that. Of course, nobody really does it. So there was a need for like a very nice automatic solution. And now we are at the time when those automatic solutions are available, and we are capable of actually looking at all the permissions which exist in the cloud and seeing what is actually used and what is redundant and what can be reduced and so on.
Yeah.
So we spent quite a lot of time optimizing and reducing those risks using automatic tools.
And do you guys have a governance process for doing a review right now, or is it more kind of conceptual, like if needed, we'll invoke this process, or where do you guys stand prior to the automation that you're talking about getting into today?
Yeah, so we don't deprecate completely like the manual review process, and of course it's required from the audit perspective and so on, but it makes it so much easier. So let's say if you can automatically remove half of the permissions, that means you need to manually review only a small fraction of that. So it makes a job of like user access review and so on much simpler.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I was talking to a customer, and they told me that they did actually have a good governance process around this IAM question, because it was one that was really plaguing them. They're a company that's also kind of born in the cloud, very fast moving organization. Their governance process was that once a quarter, they would stop development for a day. They generated a set of random tasks. It would be things like, hey, Jeremy, go try to create an EC2 instance in this account in US East 1. Hey, Tyler, please try to go fetch objects out of any S3 buckets from this account. Basically this set of tasks, and they distributed it to 800 developers and in a spreadsheet form. And they spent half a day trying to execute all those tasks. And then they handed that off to the security team, who then spent, the better part of a month trying to track down, why those things happen. And to me, that really leads to, I think, one of the other points is, the request authorization process, aside from the complexity of the overall identity landscape, the request authorization process is something that I think is not particularly well understood. And it's something that I think, really has a lot of steps in it. So Tyler, I know that AWS is something that you've spent some time working with, and this process that we've got on screen here is specifically taken from AWS. Let's just walk through it kind of left to right for a second here. So we've got a request, like let's say Tyler trying to access an S3 bucket. First thing, we look for an explicit deny around that. So is there something that is governing, like, Tyler or anybody can never access S3 buckets? So that's one. Two, we look at something called service control policies, which is like inside like a larger organization. So if you've got kind of an umbrella structure sitting over your cloud accounts or over things like your Google projects, You can push policies from a top level down, but then you go through a number of kind of granular checks. So is there a policy on a specific bucket that would either allow or deny? Is there a permissions boundary? Like, are you trying to access with a user account from one account into an S3 bucket in another account, and there's like a allow or a deny between those two things? Then there's a session policy associated to what's going on, and that can be generated either from the user side or from an application or from an assume role. And then finally, you've got your own identity policy, which is Tyler as an individual. When you guys think about designing secure identity structures for your organization, do you take this flow into account, or do you try to simplify it? And how do you think about the kind of navigating the complexity, which yes, gives you a lot of granularity and a lot of, let's say, freedom to explicitly allow or deny at many, many levels, versus the complexity that encompasses? How do you approach designing policies to navigate this?
Sometimes with great difficulty. We leverage all aspects of these. We've got service control policies that will restrict access to specific services, regions. Allstate being a pretty large company with some well-established security policies and architecture reviews. We can't just go use any old cloud service because of various implications, or they don't want to duplicate different product offerings inside the company or services. So we use service control policies for sure, and we block some things out. Then the rest of it, it gets tricky with some of these types of policies. The quote unquote security team has some control over, and some others not necessarily, or at least not directly, especially as you get into the resource-based policies. Those largely fall to the teams that are building those resources to set those up and set those right. And if they do it in a certain way, I can't even look at it. Take a KMS key policy. If I'm not set up, we don't use users, so we use roles. If my role is not set up as a user or an administrator, which I shouldn't be an administrator, I can't see anything about that policy. So I can't tell you if it's misconfigured. In some cases, Amazon can't tell you that either. So that's something that I don't know that we've got a great handle on right now, and how to help teams set those right. But where we spend a lot of time are the permissions that we assign to the identities, and being able to help teams set those right. Even if you're a seasoned developer in the cloud, a senior cloud engineer, when you go look at a new service, you probably don't know how to configure the policy for that and understand what is possible, what's necessary, what kind of things should you avoid. And that's where we try to spend a good deal of time, is looking at these services and helping to come up with a set of recommended policies based on what you need to do. So that as you go look at a service, you don't have to go figure it out from scratch. And think about if you as a senior engineer are having trouble with it, you better believe your junior engineers are completely lost, or are going to have a much harder time. So we try to help, set some standards, best practices, and help everybody get through that learning curve, but they don't have to go figure out every time. I mean, think about this from the economies of scale. If you've got, I'll just pick a number. If you get 1,000 cloud engineers trying to develop for EC2, are they all going to have to go figure out how to set a policy? Well, if you do, you're wasting a lot of valuable time. So we try to make that learning curve a lot easier to get through. And what's the term? Make it shallower? I don't know. I always get lost with that one, but. We have some automation and some things in place that try to help get through that, which I think we're going to talk about solutions in a few minutes still. But we try to help everybody get at the same place without having to spend weeks, months, and go through 1,000 error messages to get there.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's some balance towards providing some guidance and some best practices and maybe like some pre-canned, I imagine that might translate as like pre-canned policies that you could put out there, but then still giving some freedom to be able to do resource level stuff that the teams might need to be able to do. I'm curious, Alexei, like from your perspective, do you have similar approaches? Do you have kind of ways that you guys have thought about it? And you know, do you come to a similar conclusion around like some guidance, best practice, reference library, if you will, versus some level of local autonomy, or where did you guys land on that?
So where we started and where we are now, it's very different. So we started with Google Cloud Platform, which was pretty new in the space, with a permission and policy model, which was quite simple. And over the years, it has evolved quite a lot, and Google engineers are constantly developing new ways to complicate identity and access management. Sometimes, of course, it makes it much simpler. But for us, we have to consciously put effort into making it simple and into making trade-offs, which would be maybe same default choices for our feature developers. One of those trade-offs which we made, for example, we restricted object level access management for GCS buckets. GCS is like S3 in Amazon.
Okay.
People shouldn't be able to set permissions on the individual objects. Otherwise, it's just too hard to audit each one of them and so on. Of course, sometimes there are exceptions and so on. But every time there is a new release from a cloud vendor, like, hey, there's a new like feature you can implement with like a fancy permission model, we always ask ourselves, is it worth like overcomplicating this model? Can we solve it some other way? So, yeah. But we had this opportunity because we saw this like permission model evolving.
Yeah, it sounds like from both of you, if I could kind of summarize like one key takeaway for anybody, number one thing is reduce complexity. It sounds like on both sides, both approaches like that your teams have taken, the first thing is to try to like just reduce the number of things. When I think about that and I go back to, let's say, you know, the 6 high level areas that I think about trying to navigate for cloud security, you know, going from like identity to authenticating identity to then authorizing based on that identity, and managing the overall kind of complexity around the many-to-many relationships and what I think of as the identity graph, which is, you know, just your classic RBAC model, role-based access control, aligning that to policy, and then machines we've talked about already. I think about machines as being kind of that next phase, right? That assume role model for the infrastructure, talking to the infrastructure. When I think about all of these, you know, like there's just this level of complexity navigating this from left to right that really becomes like a little bit overwhelming on the surface. There's a question that came in from the audience, and this is around audits. So question that auditors ask when it comes to reviewing your identity and access management. How do you validate that the person who is doing that review, whether it's like we talked about, let's say the quarterly governance, or whether it is actually getting more in depth on a specific scenario, like let's say, you know, you have an access that is either not working the way it's designed, or you've got problems in access. How do you validate that the person who is doing the review is authorized and capable to do that review? How have you guys thought about that, Tyler? Because I imagine, you know, Allstate being an insurance company, I imagine you deal with regulators and audits on a pretty regular basis, right?
and then some. From, you know, some of my interactions, I think the auditors, I think the first problem is that they don't understand the cloud very well. And so they're looking at cloud from an on-prem perspective, and they don't understand these concepts very well to be able to audit them correctly. Other cases I've seen, and you know, hire an outside company, and that's usually where you'll find people that understand it. So I guess that first comment applies more towards an internal audit organization. They understand security, but not how it applies in the cloud. So you usually see better auditing as it comes from third-party companies that will come in and do audits. You know, and sometimes I don't really have much of a choice but to let them take a look, but we try to, for me, I take the I don't really trust you perspective. If they're, usually what I've seen the audits, they're looking at something in particular, so that's what I give them access to. I I don't want an auditor to just go in and look at absolutely everything in the cloud, because now they've got a map of my infrastructure. Great. If that gets leaked, well, I'm going to have a problem. So, you know, sometimes when they come to us and say, hey, we need to get access to these particular accounts and we need to audit them, I don't really have a choice but to trust them, because they're coming in from the information security organization that I'm tied to, but I keep them at a distance still.
This is one of the big challenges that I've heard from a number of InfoSec teams over the last 4 years or so that I've been really heads down focused on, like, large scale cloud security, working with customers, is a lot of organizations, and you kind of hinted at this earlier, Tyler, a lot of organizations face the challenge that InfoSec itself doesn't have visibility into everything. And, you know, I've often been, one of the kind of adages that I go back to is, like, if you can't see it, there's no way you can be expected to protect it. Like, and you know, that visibility has to be there. I may not need to have access to everything. I may not need to be able to, like, go inside it, read the data or whatnot. But if I can't see that it's there and I can't see how it's configured, I can't tell you whether it's secure or not. And yeah, really, I appreciate your perspective on that. And it brings up actually one of the other questions that's come in from the audience. Alexi, I'm sure the concept of zero trust is something that you guys have heard many times. Where would you say that you are in terms of a journey towards a zero trust model? And maybe, like, just to start off, maybe give some context to the audience around how you think about zero trust, what that means to you, and how you guys are approaching that.
Yeah, so one of the classic definitions of securing networks is, like, creating a backend network which has some sort of a VPN access inside. Once you cross this, like, access boundary, you have access to everything. And everything inside of that network is implicitly authorized to access everything else. And it's a bit of an old idea about securing infrastructure. And it's, of course, now it's replaced by this, like, this model of multi-layered security. So you don't really rely on a single security control. You introduce security controls at every step, potential step of the kill chain. So, for example, even if you have HTTPS authentication authorization on the website, it might still make sense to put it behind VPN just in case it's like a super secret service. So that's the concept about multi-layered security. And zero trust is basically an extreme end of that. Like, we don't really assume identities, we don't trust anybody, we just assume something has been breached. And historically, Spotify was on the pretty liberal end of that, on more classic model of securing infrastructure and so on. So we have been heavily investing in this zero trust initiative, especially on the backend-to-backend communication side of things. And that's where the discussion of like workload identity sort of links in. So we can use Google native services to basically verify that the services that talk to each other have like the right, basically that connection originates from the right machines. So we came pretty far in implementing that, rolling out to like different parts of infrastructure, GKE clusters, and so on. And I just wanted to say that it's dangerous to become complacent, like, hey, we secure this and so on, but in reality, like, this journey never ends. So there's always a way to like impersonate the other machine. There's always a way to like steal a token. There was a famous Shopify incident a couple of years ago, and yeah, they took a screenshot of the metadata service and so on. So there are ways to still like breach that model. So don't be complacent.
Yeah. So again, back to kind of like good governance goes a long way, even on the journey when you're working towards like a very admirable goal with a very secure end state where, you know, identity is bound to workloads talk to each other in a zero trust model where nothing can talk to anything else unless they actually have the right identity authentication and authorization to talk to each other. You know, it's a little bit like the lyrics, right? Like, they know the rules, you know the rules, and so do I. that's how it's got to be for these things to be able to talk to each other. But even on that process, you need to review periodically and make sure that you're heading down the right path. We've got some great questions coming in from the audience. I'm curious, I want to go to each of you in turn. Since Alexi just talked first, we'll go to Tyler next first, and then we'll come to Alexi. How often does your organization actually update your IAM policies? Because it sounds like, you've got a model where you're maybe creating like a good set of reference policies where you've got the permissions designed in the way that you want them. Is this something that changes frequently, or is it something that changes infrequently and you've got good oversight into it?
Oh, it changes all the time. Daily,
okay.
Hourly, sooner, and the reason for that is if you want to do something in AWS, it will almost always involve a change to IAM, usually a policy. Or creating a role for something. So, take Lambda. A good practice is that you don't have a single or a small set of IAM roles that your Lambdas use. No, your Lambda should have a very specific policy and role attached to it that let it do only what it needs to do. And ideally, let's say you've got 25 Lambdas. They're all going to log to different log streams. I don't mean concurrency of the Lambda. I mean separate, distinct functions. They're all going to log to their own different log streams. Don't give them a common policy that lets them broadcast all the log streams, but make it specific. So as you deploy each new piece of the infrastructure, you're deploying new identities or updates to a policy to let that infrastructure communicate and connect. So IAM, if you're doing it in such a way that you rarely make changes, you most likely are not doing least privilege. In fact, I guarantee you're not doing least privilege. You think you are, but at some point you have something that's broad enough that's being used everywhere that you're not changing it. Then it's too big. It's too monolithic of a permission.
Alexi, how about you guys? Changing frequently? And by the way, what changes most often for you? Is it users, groups, roles, policies?
Yeah. So in Spotify, we segment services into different GCP projects, and teams who own those projects, they have complete control over all resources which exist in those projects for now. So they change those permissions at will, and we just apply a set of controls on top of that. So if somebody, let's say, grants an editor role to a service account, we sort of guess that it might be a mistake. So we tell people, and we most likely we will not proactively remove this binding, but we would still let developers know, hey, are you sure that you want to do that? Maybe there's a better way. So yeah, same changes all the time.
Got it. And what changes most? Is it users, groups, roles, policies, or is it all of the above?
All of the above. I would say we have maybe a bit more control on the group management. We have some ITGC processes and so on, but still, even at these days, Spotify teams are quite fluid. So people join and disband teams all the time, and the services change ownership all the time and so on. So it's not even eventually consistent. It's just like chaos.
Got it. We've got about 7 minutes left, and we've got some great questions still coming in, but I want to talk about some of the best practices. We've already worked a couple of them in, things like a reference library of known good policies. And I think one of the things that, Alexi, you just mentioned in your response there, like this cannot be stressed enough. You must communicate. You must talk to them about, oh, you did this, and maybe you did this because you needed a particular type of access. Is there a better way that we, coming from the security side, can work with you to help you design? I mean, I think like in too many organizations, we talked about the friction that exists between wanting to move fast, wanting to have full control, full agility, and yet the need to stay secure. We, as InfoSec practitioners, we do ourselves a disservice if we don't try to work with those teams and communicate to them, why we're interested in the things we're interested in, why we need the visibility, why we're recommending certain policies. So let's talk a little bit about some of the best practices. We talked about zero trust. There's one question that's come in that I imagine both of you are probably doing in one way, and that's the idea of IAM pruning, right? So kind of paring back permissions. If we think about like a journey towards zero trust and we think about a journey towards least privileged access, LPA, like making sure that Jeremy really only has permissions to access the thing that Jeremy needs. And let's review Jeremy's permissions on an, I don't know, 30, 60, or 90-day basis. And anything that he hasn't used, he probably doesn't need. Let's take that away from him. Is this IAM pruning? Is it something that you guys have put into practice? If so, what are some of the lessons learned and tips that you would share with the audience around that? Maybe let's come to Tyler first, if we could.
So the pruning of permissions themselves, that's in my backlog still. I've been working on a couple of foundational pieces, pruning more the notion of identities themselves and their policies that haven't been used, not yet the permissions in the policy. So I'm gonna take a step back, and it actually pokes at the question from Paul Carter about balance. So, you know, most security organizations aren't very good like application developers. I mean, it's like daily in the job right now. I would suggest that cloud security teams, if they don't have development tools and experience and staff nearby, go make some friends, go get some developers, because the way that you can make a lot of this easier is by building tools, building automation, making it easy. I've worked at a place where IAM was Wild West. Any developer could go do anything they wanted at any time they wanted in the cloud, build any policy, any role, any user, and do anything they wanted to do. That's extraordinarily dangerous and bad. And so one of the ways that we combat that problem at Allstate is that, don't gasp when you hear it, but it's centrally controlled, right? If you decentralize the control over IAM, you have no control. So we bring it centrally. It's stored in GitHub. It's built with Terraform Enterprise, building out to all of our different accounts. And every change comes in through a pull request to GitHub or through our automation process. We've got an API that we developed where a team can come to it and say, I need to build a role that I'm going to use in Lambda. I need to have access to these things. So then we'll go build a role in a policy using our library and get them a policy, which helps solve the problem of this group doesn't actually know what they want in the policy or what they need to put in the policy to make it all work. So we've pre-compiled that, and then we've built them something that will go provision the role and policy within minutes in the account. So that shortens the cycle of trying to get something created. They don't have to figure it out. They're not using the console. They don't have to write their automation. They don't necessarily have to go learn Terraform to go build identities. But we handle that for them and go build that out. And we leverage DivvyCloud, so we know what is and what isn't used, and that we're just about to connect that back to our repository and then go prune roles and policies out of there. We have all of the policies themselves as JSON documents, so we'll be able to see what isn't used. So if you're a Lambda function, you've got EC2 actions that you've not used.
Awesome. Sounds like a really sophisticated approach. And I love the idea of having that stored externally where it can be, it can be referenced outside of the cloud environment for those that need to. And you've got that great change log of differentials between different commits along the way. So you can see exactly what changed. That's great. Alexei, how about you guys in terms of pruning back permissions? Is that something that you guys have started down that process or down that path?
Yes, we are using native GCP products to do that. And I think it's one of those controls which is, it just improves productivity greatly. And people don't really know we're using it. We're like automatically applying pruning to all the permissions which are not used. And yeah, we are quite happy with that approach. And of course, we are maybe on the opposite spectrum from Tyler now. Our permission model, it's really decentralized. So it's really chaos. So we pretty much have to use it. There is no good people process to review permissions and so on. But most likely we are going to be moving towards more centralized model of declarative infrastructure. But maybe one thing which is very important is that at a certain size it becomes pretty dangerous to generalize and impose processes on all the services and all the different aspects in the company. So we might have a strict process for services which process user data, like, hey, you need to go through this declarative way of like reviewing, giving access, and so on. For your hub project, we don't really care. You can use Google Cloud Console and so on. So being like flexible and pragmatic, I think it's more important than just generalizing everything.
Yeah, makes sense. And we've got one last question from the audience here. Let me try to see if I can. Oh, it just disappeared. And I think that's because we're up at time on our session, unfortunately. Well, thank you so much to the audience. And I do apologize that last question we ran out of time for. We've got a hard stop here, evidently. But I just want to take a quick sec to summarize. So centralize as much as possible, reduce complexity, try to work with the teams, communicate, and then make sure that you understand this is a continuous journey. Governance is going to go a long way towards helping you get there. And a huge thank you to Tyler and Alexei for sharing their expertise and their experiences in today's session, and for the time and just the willingness to share. That's fantastic. So yeah, we know that Cloud IAM can be challenging. There are solutions. They can be a combination of technical, process, and communication for sure. So coming up next, there will be a live demo of DivvyCloud by Rapid7. And then following that, we've got a session titled Anatomy of a Cloud Breach that'll be back here on the main stage. So what you're going to want to do is you can join that brief demo. To see the demo, click the agenda tab above and join the session. Once that wraps, join us back here on the main stage for a great session on that Anatomy of a Cloud Breach, a practical guide to understanding and exploring risk. And thank you all so much again for your time, your great questions today. And just one more thank you for Tyler and Alexei for sharing here with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thank you again.